You're not talking pigmentation. You're talking a symbolic use of white. And if it's a symbolic use of white, it's got to be a symbolic use of black. So the text, if you go through the text itself only supports a reading of where this is allegorical, where it's an image, it's a literary device. If you go to anything medical, it just can't happen. You can't change pigmentation that fast.
Mormonism with the Mirth, where Larry Singh explores church history and the church's truth claims. Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, Mormonism with the Mirth, where Larry Singh explores the church's history and the church's truth claims. This is part 2 of the interview I've been doing with scholar and researcher of the Book of Mormon, Brant Gardner. Brant, welcome back. In part 1, if you didn't watch it, we had a discussion about does the Book of Mormon allow and is there any implicit references to there being other peoples there, because we know from archaeology and science that there were populations and peoples living in the Americas before the Nephites and the Lamanites and before the Jaredites came as well. So we had a bit of a discussion about that. And we also had a discussion about Lamanites, how the Book of Mormon, the text of the Book of Mormon defines Lamanites as more of a broad term, and Brant's response to some of the criticisms about like, well, then who are the Lamanites? So this episode is going to be focusing on racism in the Book of Mormon and understanding and different interpretations or theories for the skin of blackness that the Lamanites are cursed with in the Book of Mormon. And Scripture Central did a recent video on it. I know David Snell did a video on it in Scenes Unscripted about a year ago. I did a video on it during my Book of Mormon series and looked at different theories. So what we're going to do is talk a little about Brant's view of the cursing of dark skin in the Book of Mormon, and maybe discuss some of the theories that were put forward in the Scripture Central video. How does that sound?
Okay, sounds good.
And also encourage people to go check out some of Brant's books. Book of Mormon is history. His book about the translation by the gift and power. That's what it's called. I've read it, but I'm bad at remembering names. And you've
Yeah,
got a new
gift and
book,
power. Yeah.
and you've got a new book as well, which unfortunately I've not had the time to read. I've been ordering too many books and not having enough time to read them all. But I am going to read it. But your new book is called was it written on engraved on
Engraven
plates?
upon plates and printed upon paper.
That's it. That's it. Awesome. So the Book of Mormon, it talks about in 2 Nephi 5 about when the Nephites and the Lamanites separate, that a curse came upon the Lamanites and that they were cursed with a skin of blackness. And there's other passages that sort of describe the Lamanites have skins being like filthiness, dark, loathsome, even savage. At least that's how they're categorized early on. And people would view that as like, one, this seems racist. God, if he's literally cursing the Lamanites with a dark skin, a skin of blackness. And critics would point to that, one, it being racist, but they might view it as this is coming from the Mound Builder myth. Some of these theories that that the Native Americans weren't civilized enough to have built these mounds, so there must have been some superior white race that did it. And then is that sort of an influence or a source for where Joe Smith is getting the Nephi and Lamanite narrative from? But maybe we'll come back to the Mound Builder myth later on. What is your view when it talks about the Lamanites being cursed with a skin of blackness? And then we'll talk about the different theories.
Yeah. One of the things that we had talked about in the previous episode was the fact that if you really read the Book of Mormon, what you need to do is remember that this was a real people writing for themselves, and they don't always tell us exactly what we want to know in the way we want to know it. So one of the things you have to do is you have to carefully read the text to find out how it fits. And this is a perfect example. We start with this skin of blackness, shows up in 2nd Nephi, and we're going, okay, whoa, I've got skin of blackness. What do I do with that? Well, before you decide that it has to mean a pigmentation of the physical skin, you ought to read the Book of Mormon and find out if that ever, if that works as a definition. Does it ever happen that that you see an action in the Book of Mormon where someone says, oh man, I knew that guy was a Lamanite because he was black. Okay. There are two instances where I think it shows you very clearly that that cannot be the case. So whatever you think of Skin of Blackness, it doesn't actually apply when you read the text of the Book of Mormon. And the first one comes from one of the war chapters in Alma. There's been this terrible war, and there's dead all over the place, and they're trying to figure out, I need to separate the Lamanites from the Nephites, because I'm going to treat the Nephites and bury them respectfully, but I'm not that interested in Lamanites. So I have to separate the Lamanites from the Nephites. And as they're going through, and this is one where the Amlicites were there who had marked their foreheads with the red.
Right.
They said, okay, I knew who the Amlicites were because they marked their forehead with red. I knew who the Lamanites were because they had shaved their head. Now think about that for a minute. If I'm white and somebody else is black, do you really think I have to go with the shaved head and that's the only way I can tell?
To distinguish.
If it's a Lamanite and he's black, he said, I figured out who he was because he was black. No, I figured out who he was because the Lamanites had shorn their heads. That's how I knew who a Lamanite was. Otherwise, how would I know? I wouldn't have known the difference when the Amlicites, except for the red on the forehead. And so what that text is telling us is in that real world, they didn't see any pigmentation difference. That it wasn't anything they could use. Now, the next one we see, it's, I think, even more clear. Captain Moroni wants to use a ruse to free some captives. And so he wants to get the Lamanites drunk. But in order to get them drunk, he has to deliver the wine to them and get them to drink it. So they've got guards, of course. And what Moroni does is he specifically says, I've got to go through my army and I've got to find a Lamanite. Well, obviously, right? First of all, he has to go searching. And he does find one. And so in our minds, because of the Skin of Blackness, we think, oh yeah, he had to find a black guy. So he could go look like the black Lamanites, right? Except he sent 6 Nephites with him. Now, if one black guy and 6 white guys show up, the Lamanite's going to look at him and go, some of these are not like the other. You can immediately tell the difference. But they couldn't. They didn't notice that. So the question then becomes, why did they have to find a Lamanite? And the answer, obviously, is language. He spoke. He's the only one who spoke. Well, he either spoke the same dialect, his accent was the same. Let's say you and I are going to go to a congregation and we're going to speak and we're going to sound like, we're coming from the same place. Well, if I don't say a word, they may not notice.
Right.
But the minute I open my mouth, they're going to say, yeah, you're not from here.
So you're saying that story, 6 Nephites went with the Lamanite, and the guards weren't able to tell that they were Nephites.
They couldn't tell the difference.
But they had the Lamanite do the talking. Whereas if there was a change in skin color, it would have been very easy to spot the Nephite from the Lamanite.
So if you go through the text and you say, is there any place, does it ever show up where skin color, where you can say the text supports the idea of a change of pigmentation? No, there's no action in the text, and every action that should show that does not. Okay, now.
So the question would be that
maybe it's just poorly written, okay? So, you say, okay, well, Joseph forgot to do that. So he was making it up and he just made up this stuff and he forgot to mention that they were black. So the next thing you do is you have to go through the text and you say, okay, well, what does blackness mean? How is it used in the text?
Right. Yeah. What does the term skin of blackness mean?
Yeah. And black and white has pretty universally been used as opposites. Every culture that I know of knows that those two are opposites. We know that every culture in the world can distinguish black and white. And not every culture has the same number of color words, but everybody does black and white. if you look at them, they are always in the context of righteousness. It's always black is bad, white is good.
Mm-hmm.
So it talks about Lamanites who become Nephites, and it says, and there's, and they become white. Okay, yeah. Now, does that mean their pigmentation changed? Well, it's talking about a conversion. It never says that these people were black, converted to the gospel, and woke up the next morning and their skin had completely changed and they looked totally different than they did the day before. Now, not to mention the fact that we do not know of any physical way that can happen. That's what the Book of Mormon says happens. All you have to do to become white is to become a Nephite. That's all you have to do. So how do you use white? Well, it's always white and delightsome, black and loathsome, but those are, opposites. And so we know why they're opposite. And they're always opposite based on righteousness. Now, to give you an idea, we have the case in 3rd Nephi where Christ comes and he's teaching the apostles. And so these are Nephites. These are the 12 disciples who have been chosen as New World apostles. They call them disciples in the Book of Mormon. But this set got to be the best of the best, right? Nephites, good guys. One of them, top of them is Nephi, or the 3rd Nephi. He's been a prophet. He's been a great guy. You get all these people together and they're praying, and the Christ is there with them. And it said they became white. I thought they were white. How
Unless they
come they
became,
became white while they were praying?
unless they became more white or had heavenly glow like an angel.
You're not talking pigmentation. You're talking you're talking a symbolic use of white. And if it's a symbolic use of white, it's got to be a symbolic use of black. So the text, if you go through the text itself only supports a reading of where this is allegorical, where it's an image, it's a literary device. If you go to anything medical, it just can't happen. You can't change pigmentation that fast.
Right.
So everything in the text says that it's going to be allegorical. Now the question then is, why do we think it's anything else? Well, because that's darn word skin and black. Think of what would have happened if for some reason, instead of saying skin of blackness, it says soul of blackness.
Or countenance of blackness.
Yeah, because you get that in the Bible. If it had said that, we would have never paid attention to it. But as modern people, and particularly when it's put into the United States, early United States, where there is definitely a problem with black slaves, and even much later than that, racial prejudice hung on forever, embarrassingly long. And if you take that background and you say, I'm already embarrassed and I already think that black skin is a terrible thing. I see skin and blackness and that's where I go. But you go there without actually looking at the text. So it's another one of those things where the text does not support it. Why is it a skin of blackness? Why is it terrible? Because that's what we thought it should be. That was our initial reaction. Isn't a reaction based on reading the Book of Mormon. It's based on what we think the Book of Mormon says. So that's my interpretation of it. And what has happened is that there are other interpretations that attempt to talk about skin coloration or differential, where it's not metaphorical. It has some real world connection. So there are several of those. You've got a list of them.
Yeah, before we jump into that, I want to ask a question about your view. So your view is that it's symbolic or sort of metaphorical, allegorical. It's not literally their skins being darker, that it's more to do with like the state of their soul, them being, so you do believe that there was a curse, this separation from God. They weren't part of this Nephite Israelite religion. So there was like
Yeah,
this
if you go
separation.
back to where the curse is separating Lamanite and Nephite and saying, yeah, don't mix.
Yeah,
Well, the Lord had told the people of Israel not to mix with others as well. So this idea of being an isolate people and sticking to yourself and not being diluted with other nations, that's not a surprising thing. So, the curse is saying don't mix. It's actually a marriage curse, if you will.
hmm
So, there's a curse because you're separated from God. The effect of the curse, the reason that it's there, is so that you don't go marry these people and bring in their religion. And God had done that in the old world with other people as well. So,
right, sure.
um, so
And
again, yeah, that's not surprising.
I have here a couple of scripture passages, I think, sort of supporting this view of it being more symbolic or more metaphorical. So I took this from the Scripture Central video. This is from Lamentations chapter 4. It says, her Nazarites were purer than snow, they were whiter than milk, but now their visage is blacker than a coal. Our skin was black like an oven. So it actually talks about their skin being black as well, about the Nazarites. And I think Job as well talks about his face being
His face
black.
was black. Yeah.
Yeah. And we wouldn't interpret those passages as like this is literally their skin changing. I think they showed as well, like in another ancient text, that ancient people might have referred to another group of like their skin's turning dark, but it wasn't literal that this was part of like the ancient culture. And there was this sort of like prejudice, this us versus them, but
Yeah.
it's more symbolic, more of a reflection of their soul. So would you agree with those verses that
Oh, yeah,
when Book of
sure.
Mormon's talking about skin of blackness is probably more in light of
Oh, yeah.
in the same
Yeah,
context as
it's
these
just
verses?
simply confirmation that reading is not strained. That's not something we make up just to defend the Book of Mormon. This has
It's in the Bible
ancient
as well.
where we go, it was there in the Bible, it's there in other cultures. It's not surprising in world history to have people described that way. Now, one of the other things that you had mentioned is where the Lamanites were described as savages. Now, that starts really, really early in the Book of Mormon. And it's another interesting thing because you see that trope throughout the Book of Mormon. It's a stereotype.
Yeah.
And stereotypes may start off with a reason, but once it's a stereotype, you don't question it. That's just the reason why it is. Um, so the stereotype takes over whether it's true or not. And again, in a close reading of the Book of Mormon, you go, no, these aren't savages. These are actually people. When we get a good view of Lamanite culture, when the sons of Mosiah go to the Lamanite lands and we get their experience in the land, everything that you read between the lines, again, where they're not saying it explicitly, but you see what the actions are. For example, they have not only kings over cities, but they have a king over kings.
Yeah.
That's a really complicated social structure. That's not savage. And it's
And
better
even
than,
like Limhi's people who were like in bondage to the Lamanites as well. So the Lamanites were
yeah,
he was sort of like the king over the land, and they were sort of
yeah,
under him as well.
yeah. So yeah, you look at those things and you're going, yeah, these are not savages. So you may have the stereotype there, and stereotyping is, human. This has nothing to do with the Book of Mormon. This is how humans react. Uh, but the stereotype goes, but all of the evidence belies that, which again tells you this is coming from a real world. This is coming from where people have a stereotype that doesn't define, does not fit all of the real world occasions. Um,
And you said as well, like you've got references to like Skin of Blackness in the Bible.
yeah,
There's probably examples of ancient people and like ancient cultures using some of this same rhetoric towards like their enemies. So like
sure.
using this
Oh
language of
yeah,
a
and
dark
it'll always be
savage.
for enemies. It's always the outsider. the worst terms you come up with are always for the outsider. There's not, there's always an us-them division. And the worst of the us-them divisions are when people start assigning really bad things like non-human status. So when you have one group that starts to refer to the other as animals or insects or something, that really bad things could happen. That's when you get, wars of devastation and, annihilation and those kinds of things. The Holocaust, for example, the Jews were vermin.
Yeah.
Why could you kill them? They're vermin. We get rid of vermin.
Right.
So those are the worst examples of it. Less deadly are the ones that just say we're better than you are and we're civilized and you're not.
And would you interpret when Joseph Smith, I can't remember which edition this was of the Book of Mormon, but I believe it was Joseph Smith who changed the Lamanites becoming, white and delightsome to pure and delightsome, and that perhaps pure is the better
I think it was for the
synonym.
1840.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. I thought it was 1840 as a better word to describe the change, that it's not about.
I think what that
color.
tells us is something very important, and that is that as Joseph thought about this and looked at it, his mind said that this is a symbolic designation and not a pigmentation designation.
Captures the
if
meaning
he'd
better.
have thought that it actually meant skin change, he wouldn't have changed it to pure. He would have said, no, this is skin change stuff. But when he says, yeah, white, maybe people will misunderstand white. Let's go with pure, because that's what it really meant. That's what the concept was. And anybody who's ever been a translator knows that there comes times when you have an option of different words where you say, I could use these two different words to support this. Which one am I going to use? And Joseph said, yeah, the meaning fits better with pure. So Joseph himself is pretty much telling us that, he believed it was symbolic rather than pigmentation change.
Right. I know I want to represent the critics here, and I know a critic would probably respond that I believe there's an 1831 revelation. I don't know. I don't think this was firsthand from Joseph, so I'm going off the top of my head. Maybe W. Phelps or someone talked about Joseph sending them to the Lamanites, and to convert them. The missionaries go to the Lamanites and to take wives unto themselves from the Lamanites, so that they can become white and delightsome. And so some might say that maybe Joseph Smith did interpret the cursing of dark skin literally upon the Lamanites, and maybe he did see it was talk about them becoming white and delightsome. Maybe he also believed that this was also a literal change in their skin color.
If it weren't for the fact that he changed that word to pure, I'd say I would assume that that's what he believed. It's very clear that other people believed that.
Yes.
So certainly the people that were going there were trying to make their skin whiter, and Spencer Kimball thought the same thing, thought that there was actually going to be a pigmentation change. So it was certainly something that was believed and taught by a lot of people, that this would change. And again, why was it taught? Because that's the way they read it. And why did they read it? Because they read it fairly literally. Again, if you look at the text, it doesn't support that reading, but nobody was looking at it that carefully. You read it very quickly, and they read it the same way the critics do. And the reason why the critics have that criticism is because it's easy to read that way. And members of the church did it. So not a surprise.
And
again, it's just not supported by the text.
So the Skin of Blackness would be viewed more as symbolic and kind of like a spiritual cursing as well. And like something that me and my wife have talked about when we've talked about this topic is, Nephi and his family, they would be coming from Israel. So they would have been like Middle Eastern. So they wouldn't have been, as white as me, an Irishman. And also, Native Americans, they're not, black, so there wouldn't be a radical difference necessarily in skin color.
An interesting example from the research that I did, and I was doing research on the white god. And so I was looking at, this image of white in Native American texts. And most of the texts that we have are in Spanish. And so somebody gave the information to a Spaniard and they wrote it down. There are a few texts that are actually in the Aztec language. And in one of them, they were describing the conquistadores that came in. So these are the Spaniards who came in.
Mm-hmm.
And there were some who had blonde hair, and they really thought that was cool because they hadn't seen that. But they remarked on the skin of the Spaniards. And the remark was, their skin is whiter than ours. So they did not consider themselves not white. They didn't consider themselves black. There were actually black Spaniards, Spanish Africans. So there were, some slaves and some black men who came with the Spaniards. And the natives did notice that their skin color was different, but they called them dirty, because the skin color was dirt, more like dirt than their skin color. But they also called them gods. So they were the dirty gods. So they never said your skin is black. That wasn't the concept they used. They just said, it looks like they've been rolling around in the dirt or something. And then as far as their skin color, it's, the Spaniards are whiter than we are. We're white, they're whiter. So from a Native American context, it didn't fit at all, that whole idea. And again, I remember there was an article a long time ago that was talking about something like black and white and red all over or something, specifically noting that the whole term skin of blackness is a little bit strange because they're not black. And the color assigned to Native Americans was always red.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
They're not really red either, but that's where it comes from. So skin of redness, you might be able to come up with, something, but skin of blackness doesn't fit. It's people at Joseph Smith's time were really pretty clear that there was a pigmentation difference between a Native American and an African American, or an African slave.
I'll ask this question now just because I think it's relevant, that a critic might think that, yes, obviously we would agree with you that, like Native Americans, their skins aren't going to change from white to dark and that they don't have black skin. But I think the critical argument would be that Joseph maybe being influenced by the Mound Builder myth and white like Europeans coming over to the Americas, and they see Native Americans who have darker skin, and they would see it as these people, they were savage, they weren't civilized, they couldn't have built these mounds, and that there had to be some more superior white race that built them, and then these savage darker Native Americans wiped them out, and that this is very similar, that Joseph could have been influenced by this, and that he sort of describes the Israelites that come over as starting white, then being cursed dark, and this being very similar to the Mound Builder myth, right?
And it's absolutely true that if you are hypothesizing that Joseph wrote the Book of Mormon, you could say that was an impetus. It was an understanding that there was a white race, and it was an understanding sort of developed and perhaps passed around more in Western upstate New York than in other places. So Joseph was right at the location where this dead white race did all the cool stuff, and we're just left with the savage natives. So what can you say about that? Well, you read the book. You can say that that's where it came from. You could look at history and find out that early saints believed it, and they read the Book of Mormon that way. And so, early proofs of the Book of Mormon follow Josiah Priest, who is talking about the mound builders and how they were built by another race that had come in that was related to Judaism, and how there are remnants of the Hebrew language, and there were several books that were quite prominent. And so it's absolutely certain that that was how the text was read. And then you have to read the text and you go, oh, wait a minute, it doesn't fit. So yeah, you could say that, but if you actually read the text, it doesn't work. Does it work in any other context? Well, again, it really works well in Mesoamerica because you can trace out things that are happening and fit them to the correct time periods. You can't do that in North America. So you have a really good theory about the mound builders, but nobody in the Book of Mormon builds a mound. There is a mound of dead, but the mounds were, they were rare. Well, some of them are used as burial sites, but you just don't get an emphasis on mound building in the Book of Mormon. There's a war, and they said we bound it and buried our dead, and they were mounded up. That's it. We did. There's nothing that says, oh, we built a symbolic snake mound or something. It's not there. So yeah, absolutely certain that was popular, absolutely certain that it was read that way by the early saints. Not at all certain that that's what the text supports. And if you read the text against history, it doesn't fit in that area. So if you're going to say, I've got to force it into North America, Book of Mormon doesn't fit and isn't going to fit well. And it would strengthen the arguments of the critics if you tried to do that, because it doesn't fit. There are other places where it does, though. So I'm not too worried about it.
So I'd like to get your response in maybe just a couple of minutes to some of the points that are possible other theories.
Yeah.
I like that they're trying to present different theories or explanations. I think maybe frustrating is the wrong word, but the difficult thing can be is that when different theories or possible explanations can be given, people can often feel like, well, which one is it? Which is, when you're providing so many different possible answers, somebody might say that there's so many different explanations that maybe none of them are right, and the critics would just say you're trying to come up with mental gymnastic explanations. So they did talk about,
and I'm not certain there wouldn't be right in some of those cases. So let's go with them.
Yeah, no,
some of them are mental gymnastics.
Some of them I find interesting as well. So I don't have a fixed view or theory. So the first one was the one which you espouse more of it being symbolic or allegorical, metaphorical. One is about it being there maybe being some black body paint or tattoos. I think they talked about them separately, but they talked about that Amlicites had a red mark that's similar to the mark that was put upon the Lamanites. And I think some of the Mayans as well would have put on like maybe some black like body paint or maybe even some like coal they talked about in the video. What are your thoughts on that being a possibility that wasn't a change in skin pigmentation, but perhaps some black body paint was put on or something like that? So that almost like their skins were darker, but it wasn't a change in skin pigmentation.
The one I actually liked the best out of all those was the one on the black paint, because we know that happened. There's pottery that shows the painting, and we know that they were not physically black because they'll show parts of the body that haven't been painted yet. So we know this is somebody who's painting their body black.
Yeah, I like that as well.
I had interactions with the person who wrote the article. I was one of the reviewers for it. And I thought it was a good article and I wanted to see it published. But I really wanted the author to kind of back off the idea that this was the explanation, because it doesn't work as an explanation. Because, well, first of all of the cases where you have the black paint, the people who tend to be painted black are the kings and the good guys. And that's not the way, the Book of Mormon is using that term. It's not saying, skin of blackness means that you're pretty darn good and you're a king. So, yes, it's black, but the context is very, very different. Now, what I hoped would happen is someone would say this use of black paint was the reason why the imagery of skin of blackness came about. That's where the term comes from. Not because it is a skin of blackness, but because there was the painting of blackness and this symbolic putting on of something else that is different. I think that's the origin of the metaphor. I think that's why the metaphor shows up the way it does. I think as an explanation for why it's skin of blackness, because it's always black, it doesn't really work because of the context of the painting. And they painted other colors for other reasons. For example, there's one of the statues that has some pigmentation left that, traces. And on the face, it really looks like they originally painted it blue. I don't know why they painted it blue, but, blue, black, there were multiple colors that would be used for multiple reasons. So skin of blackness, skin of blueness, skin of stripedness. I mean, you get all kinds of designations. So I think as a real explanation for a skin of blackness, I don't think it works. As an explanation for why the metaphor may have been developed, why it's skin of blackness and not soul of blackness or face of blackness, I think it has decent explanatory power, but not as an explanation for, this always explains Lamanites and nobody else. For example, in much later, we get Chichen Itza, which in the old blue books of Mormon that had color panels in them, they would have one of these murals from the Temple of the Warriors that was talking about this great big battle. And it has dark and light warriors fighting against each other. And it was used to say, look, there's white Indians, there's the white people right there. Except they didn't have any other way of symbolically telling you who was who, who's fighting whom, who's the good guy, who's the bad guy, or, which army you're on. You didn't have the blue coats and the gray coats, so you had the dark skins and the white skins. But it doesn't mean that they were white. It just meant that was the artistic representation. So, yeah, again, I don't see that as much of an argument, although, again, I like that best out of all of them. The tattooing, yeah, they use tattooing. It's really hard to see how that would fit. It probably works best if you say that the Amlicites tattooed themselves on their forehead. That could be, but it kind of says that they did it kind of last minute, and the Nephites probably would have recognized that something was different about them. It just doesn't fit culturally. If people are starting to tattoo, everybody kind of gets it. And you may have people who are resistant, and you look across the United States now, and the resistance to tattooing has decreased markedly because so many people have tattoos that it's now more culturally accepted. So once you start, it's hard to see that as a distinction.
And if somebody were to try to defend the black body paint or somehow putting the mark upon them, saying that, well, why does that verse, and I can get the verse, what it exactly says, but something along the lines of the Amlicites put on a red mark, similar to the mark that was put upon the Lamanites, almost indicating or implying from that the Lamanites had to have put on some sort of mark on themselves, comparative to what the Amlicites did.
Yeah. What they all mean is hard to separate from the way we read it, because we frankly read it with very racist attitudes. We read racism into it because our history contains so much racism that we're primed to see that in anything. So we tend not to look at other meanings, or if somebody suggests another way to read it, we're saying, oh no, it doesn't seem that, but it's the way we read into it.
Not even in a racist, like, change in skin color, but somebody who advocates that it was black body paint might say that if the Amalekites put a mark on themselves, like it was red, wasn't on their foreheads, but that's comparable to what the Lamanites did, does this support the Lamanites putting some sort of, maybe body paint or some sort of
Yeah.
black tattoo or something on it. Maybe.
Yeah. And again, they actually did use black body paint. We know it. We know the contexts where we see it tend to be the more important members of society that are getting the black body paint. And
So it
you can
wouldn't
be
work for every
absolutely
person
certain
that's
that not
labeled.
everybody does it every day. You
Yeah.
know,
It wouldn't work for every person that's labeled
no.
as a Lamanite, but you're open to the possibility of
And
there being
certainly you
some
can see them
physical mark.
going into battle with some indication. Everybody wants to have an indication of who's on our side and who's against us. You want to know who to swing the axe at.
Yeah, so like, what if there's some sort of physical mark to distinguish them that they maybe put on culturally, perhaps like when there's a
Yeah,
battle, or maybe
they
when
may
they
have.
first
I
saw
mean,
them.
Native Americans used war paint.
Yeah,
They would use something to make color on the body. And it certainly wouldn't be surprising that, that influenced the way people saw the Amosite mark, from, the Native American war paint. But again, reality is, if you're talking about the whole population, you're not painting yourself every day, and not
no,
everybody's getting painted. This is a very rare kind of thing. So when you say all of the Lamanites had a skin of blackness, well, all of the Lamanites, if you're looking at the evidence we have of the pottery, all of the Lamanites don't. It's only, the upper echelon, and probably in specific ritual situations. So again, I see that as a possible explanation for the metaphor. I don't see it as a definition of the reality.
right. This is the one I probably found the weakest or least persuasive, but talked about the skins about the Lamanites' loins, or maybe their garments, that it was dark, it was black, as opposed to
Yeah.
the Nephites. What are your thoughts on that? As skins of blackness is referring to the skins about their loins, or the skins they are
Um,
wearing.
I, I think it tries too hard. Um, to say that people wear certain kinds of clothing and that makes a distinction. Sure, we always tell people by the clothing that they're wearing. If you're military, you really want to know who's on your side and who's on the other side. So clothing is going to distinguish you. In ancient, and it's even in modern Guatemala, people from one city will have a specific dress that is different from another. And if somebody comes in and you know what you're looking at, you can say, I know what town you're from because I can see in your clothing that you've got the clothing of that town. So yes, we use clothing as a marking, but to point that out and to say, this is why this skin of blackness is there, I think it tries too hard to take skin of blackness literally, and then tries to shift it away from pigmentation to clothing. I think it's a stretch.
Yeah,
I've never been fond of that one.
yeah, I have to agree. This is one that wasn't in the video. This is a theory that I had espoused previously. I want to get your thoughts on it. That perhaps because of the Lamanites, them being separated from the Nephites and them intermixing with local indigenous people that were there, perhaps there was a natural slight change in skin color, not them turning like black, but maybe slightly darker than the Nephites. What if it's the
Yeah,
Nephites who have been told to separate from the Lamanites, seeing sort of a natural change in skin color that they are then attributing that to God? So it's sort of a reflection of the Nephites' racism. What are your thoughts
yeah,
on that theory? That perhaps there was a slight natural change in skin color from, mixing with darker indigenous people there.
yeah. And I think that's uh,
Do you think that should have made it
that
in the
that was
video?
a reasonable way to try to make the distinction, to say, yeah, here's how nature might work. The problem is it doesn't follow through. It therefore presumes that the Nephites never intermarried with anybody that was there. And you can't really hold that position either. You can't say that the Lamanites are the only ones that ever mixed and the Nephites stayed absolutely genetically pure. No, couldn't happen. There's no evidence for it in the Book of Mormon. All the evidence in the Book of Mormon is they had to have mixed with another population. And if mixing with that population makes the Lamanites darker, it makes the Nephites darker, and there's no skin differentiation. So it was an interesting idea, but it doesn't work when you think about it.
Yeah, no, that's kind of a flaw in the theory. I still think they should have proposed it in the video. So and last question, what if somebody watching this might say that, why does it matter what, Brant Gardner has to say, or this video from Scripture Central providing different theories, like throughout the past, different prophets and church leaders have viewed the skin of blackness as literal. We talked about President Spencer W. Kimball talking about the Native Americans who convert, that their skins will turn more white, and that now the church, in the past decade or so, is disavowing the past sort of racial theories about dark skin being a sign of a curse or God's disfavor. But somebody might say, like, why should we listen to what scholars or apologists have to say? Like, shouldn't the church be providing a answer or an explanation? What would be your response to that? I know you're not you don't view yourself as the definitive voice or answer on this, but what would be your response to somebody who might feel that way?
I would say the first thing to remember is that the church has addressed it, but they addressed it prophetically, which is kind of what you expect. So not as an explanation, but just as a declaration. So if someone says, well, how come they haven't explained why all of this happened? Well, they didn't. What did they do? They said, okay, here's what we currently believe. You should not, be racist. You shouldn't judge people. And so that declaration has come down. Now,
and God doesn't literally curse people with darker skin.
Yeah. And so, that's what the modern prophet said. If you believe the church has prophets today that you're supposed to follow, it's pretty clear. Don't be racist. That's not part of the church. Church is inclusive, and certainly it had a history. Obviously, for a long time they didn't, proselyte in Africa because there were way too.
Okay, we're back after technical difficulty on my end. Had to go reboot the internet. So the question I asked was why some people might say that why even listen to, Brant Gardner or what apologists or scholars have to say, trying to provide different interpretations or theories for Skin of Blackness. But, there's been prophets and church leaders, from the Book of Mormon who have interpreted it literally. And although the church now, has disavows past racist teachings, that it's still in the Book of Mormon. It's still in, the Book of Moses or Book of Abraham, and that the church should provide an explanation for what this means. Why listen to scholars who are providing different theories? What would be your response to someone who would bring up that criticism?
Yeah, now that I think about the question, particularly when you phrase it that way, the church is a revelatory church where it can say that we're going to disavow the racist past. I mean, it's not that it was never there. We kind of know it was. Wish it wasn't. It would be nice if it were, something we could be more proud of than that. But what they do is they say, here is what the doctrine is now. This is, you should not be racist. You should not do that. We disavow everything that went before. So the church as a leadership deals in declarations, not in explanations. When does the church explain? Well, technically, the church really doesn't explain much. And I think the best way I can use an example is to go to the Gospel Topics essays. And I think some of them have been renamed now, and I'm not up on what the renaming is. But But the series of essays where the church is trying to do some explaining, we'll get this word right. So the church is trying to do some explaining, but how does it do it? You don't have an apostle who writes the article. They have scholars write the articles. They say, here's what the best scholarly information is, and we'll put it in a place that we have looked at it and agreed, and we support it, but we didn't write it. Well, why wouldn't they write it? Well, because they're not historians. These aren't their specialties. These are people who have specialty in guiding the spiritual welfare of the people that they're in charge of. They're not historians. They're not linguists. They're not. In many cases, they're not really conversant with the ancient world, and certainly not experts in DNA. And so, when they needed to have explanations, they went to the scholars, and they said, "Scholars, write them." Now, they did not say, "Scholars, you write them, and we'll put whatever you say up on the board." They did review them. I happen to know, at least in the case of the one on DNA, it was cut down severely, and apostles vetted that article. So they know about it. It wasn't a surprise to them. They made sure that if it was put up under the church's imprimatur, that they agreed with it, but they didn't write it. So for those who want to know, why do you want to believe me instead of the church past? Well, the church past is the church past. If you want to know what the church believes now, ask the prophets, and they'll tell you this is what we believe. If you want someone to explain, to try to look at what does the text of the Book of Mormon actually look like, that's not what they do. And so you have to look at some sort of a scholar, and you have to decide, which scholarly arguments you want to believe. You might believe mine, you might believe somebody else. But I think if you're asking the question, why doesn't the church do it? When the church does it, it goes to the scholars.
Right. Kind of reminds me of, in the Doctrine and Covenants, when the Lord says to seek out, learning from wisdom from the best books, seek learning by study and also by faith.
Yeah.
And I remember listening to Elder Russell M. Ballard once. He's recently passed away, but can't remember what the setting was, but he said if he has a historical question, or if somebody were to ask, say, a seminary or institute teacher a difficult historical question, to go to a scholar who knows a lot about that subject. And that's something that even the apostles would do as well. And it probably comes back to our assumptions that they have this direct pipeline and can receive clear answers to every single gospel or scriptural or scholarly question. And that comes back
and
to
they
your
don't need to. That's not what their calling is. And like any of us, there are experts in certain fields, and when you need expertise, you go to the expert, and you don't have to be the expert. So the fact that they have a different calling, that's perfectly fine. And the fact that they go to the scholars who know what they're talking about, I think, is evidence of, I think, frankly, a shift in the way the church relates to scholarship. The church has had times in its past when it has been very anti-scholarship. And gratefully, we are not in that period right now. Right now, the scholars are recognized and accepted. And in many of the cases, when you're talking about history, you're talking about people who have been through the documents. They've been through everything. So there are, subject field experts, and they tend to ask the experts rather than, try to become an expert themselves. They have other things to do.
Right. Yeah. Actually, I want to make or ask this last question. Well, I don't know if it's so much a question, but sort of like the statement, and the Book of Mormon Central video talks about that, we've been discussing racism in the Book of Mormon, but that there's other passages that you could almost say is racially unifying about the book, or is trying to go against racism, like after when Christ comes and there's no manner of ites, or that
Yeah.
passage in, I think it's somewhere in Second Nephi, that God invites all to come unto him, black and white, male or female. And when you look at it in totality, that it's quite a racially unifying text. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Again, if the way you are going to read the Book of Mormon is to say that the Book of Mormon actually has the information in it that you want to know, that's part of it, because that's in the Book of Mormon. And that's the reason why you really need to read what the whole text says as an entirety, rather than saying, here is the one verse that I'm going to pick out and use it to, as a battering ram for the way I interpret that verse. You have to read what the whole text says. And so is there racism in the Book of Mormon? Yes, they really don't like Lamanites. And it's a very stereotypical thing. They talk smack about Lamanites, and call them uncivilized, even when the text itself is pretty clear they're not uncivilized. Now, is that normal for human populations? Absolutely. You expect that in an ancient document. Not a surprise at all. But then when you read the rest of it, you say, well, does it tell us to be racist? And Christ's message has never been that. Christ's message has always been inclusive. Christ's message does not care who you are. Christ's message says, come unto me. I'll take you all. And the Book of Mormon repeats that. And as we talked in the other session, that very inclusive way that Mormon is seeing Lamanite as, anybody who has not yet accepted the gospel. That's a pretty inclusive thing. That's saying, everybody come unto me. This is for everyone. The Book of Mormon is for everyone. So it was written by human beings, and they have their own issues. And at times they are racist, and they don't like Lamanites, or the Lamanites don't like the Nephites. I mean, it's mutual. But it's not telling us to be that way. It's telling us to be better.
Awesome. Well, Brant, I've really loved doing this interview with you. I think we should stop in case my internet goes out again, but I've really enjoyed the topics we were able to discuss. Make sure you go check out his books and watch our previous episodes as well. Check out part 1 if you haven't. I'll put some links as well where you can watch the Scripture Central video or some articles on this as well. And thanks everyone for watching this episode. Please give it a like, please comment, please share. If that helps with the algorithms, will help the channel to grow. Subscribe as well. And we'll see you next time on Mormonism with the Murph. Take care, everyone. Thanks, Brant.
Take care.
Thanks everyone for watching this episode. If you've enjoyed it, please give it a like, share it with others who might benefit, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future content. You can also listen to these episodes on podcast form on Anchor or Spotify, and you can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Check out my website for more content, personal blog, and more. And if you care to donate to support me, you can via my PayPal or Patreon, or through the website. And you can also give donations via YouTube through Super Chats. Thanks for watching Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye-bye.